All right, great. Good afternoon. I'm Steve Slake, the Director of the Intelligence Study Project here at the University. On behalf of our colleagues at the Strauss Center for International Security at Law, the Center for National Security, and our hosts at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Welcome to today's book talk on Damascus State. Many of you are familiar with our regular book talks, but we're breaking some new ground today. Since, at least in my experience, this is the first time we've ever held a featured at an event a book of fiction, So that's pretty exciting. So before I introduce the author and kick off our conversation today, I wanted to remind you all of several upcoming events. So next Monday at the lunch hour, the Strauss Center is hosting Noah Phillips, Commissioner from the Federal Trade Commission, for a talk at the law school called, or entitled, The Power of Your Data, Big Tech, Privacy, and National Security. Following up on today's event, the Strauss Center will host a conversation on November 29th with Anna Boyshevskaya from the Washington Institute on Russian Policy in the Middle East. And finally, on the 1st of December, the Clements Center is organizing a talk in the Bass Lecture Hall, this way, by Chris Kalenda on his upcoming book, Zero Sum Victory, What We're Getting Wrong About War. So I'm obviously delighted and proud to report that our calendar is filling up with live in-person events, and we're slowly escaping the evil clutches of Zoom. So this is fun for all of us. So our guest today, visiting all the way from Dallas, is David McCluskey, the author of Damascus Station. David's a former CIA analyst and also a consultant with McKinsey & Company. David's unusually spare biography, that we hope to flesh out a bit more today, notes that while he was at CIA, he wrote regularly for the President's Daily Brief, worked in field stations across the Middle East, and also briefed senior White House officials, ambassadors, and Arab royalty. So I've asked David to open with a short introduction or overview of his book, after which I'll join him in a conversation about his career, the novel, and Middle East politics. And at the end, at the close, we'll save time for your questions. So think about that. So David, welcome to the University of Texas. Thank you.
This is fun. Thank you, Steve, for that kind and sparse introduction of my bio. I'll try to fill some of that in. And thanks for having me here. It's still, as a alumnus of both McKinsey and the CIA, I'm sort of accustomed to a lifetime in secret and highly secretive organizations. Being out actually speaking about a book that I wrote that's got my name on it, that's in the wild, is still pretty cool and pretty fun. So thank you for hosting me here. For those who haven't read it, I thought I'd just describe a little bit about what the book is about, and then tell you a little bit more about me and how I came to write it. So Damascus Station, it is a work of fiction. It's a novel. It's a spy novel. It is set in the early years of the Syrian Civil War. It follows a CIA case officer named Sam and his Syrian recruit Miriam, who break one of the cardinal rules of espionage and fall into a forbidden relationship. They go into Damascus to hunt down the killer of another CIA officer, and in that process really come kind of face to face with their tension and the conflict and the passion in their own relationship, as well as into conflict with a brutal pair of Syrian brothers who are in the military and security services and who are guarding a very dark secret at the heart of the Syrian regime. So it's obviously a spy novel, so it's about espionage, but it's also about love, and I hope it's also about what it means to be human in the middle of a very inhuman conflict. As is probably apparent from my bio and just describing the book, none of that would have been possible without my past life at the CIA. So I actually came to the CIA through, I think it's not too well known. I was an undergrad. I was 19 when I took my first polygraph, actually, for the agency. And there's an internship program that brings folks in when they're in their undergrad years, and you do 2 summers, and then if it's a good fit, you can join full time. The head of what was then known as NISA, which was the Near East and South Asian Analytic Office, was an alum of my pretty small school outside of Chicago, and he came through Chicagoland on a recruiting trip. And I was 19. I wanted to understand the world, travel the world, learn how it worked. And most of my professional experience up to that point had been as a cashier at Wendy's in high school. And so the CIA calling felt like a bit of a step up. So I was really interested in enrolled, I think applied, kind of thinking, well, there's no way this is actually gonna work, so I'll see what happens. But was fortunate enough to get the offer to make it through the clearance process. The first summer I was there, I worked on the 34-day war between Israel and Hezbollah. The second summer was the run-up to what became this the Israeli strike on Syria's nuclear reactor out of the Eastern Desert at Al Tabar. And so I was really, just after those experiences, pretty hooked. I joined full-time after I graduated. I worked primarily on Syrian political and security topics. Although I did a rotation in the Counterterrorism Center focused on targeting the foreign fighter networks that were shipping folks through Syria into Iraq to target coalition forces and Iraqi civilians. But most of the work I did was focused on Syria. And as a result, I ended up having a really front row seat for the uprising in early 2011. I was working on the account. And that, you know, Steve and I, I'm sure we'll talk about it a lot more in conversation, but that experience working in those early years, that really saw the kind of optimism of this protest movement turn into a pretty bloody civil war, was a very professionally and personally impactful time for me. And just to paint some of the kind of shattering that has happened to Syrian society. I mean, it was a country of 23 million people prior to the war. About half of that population now is either displaced internally or has actually fled the country. The poverty rate, depending on the statistics you look at, is somewhere between 80 and 90%. It's effectively split between 4 different kind of zones of influence or control. And over 500,000 Syrians have died in the war. And that's based on the UN number that I think is about 5 or 6 years old, because the UN stopped counting the casualty numbers. Not to mention the hundreds of thousands more who sort of disappeared into, regime detention centers and things like that. So, as a analyst watching this and having spent time in Syria and in the region, it was a really pretty emotional and kind of heartbreaking experience to have lived through this and watched it. And so when I left the agency in 2014, and I had some time in between leaving CIA and joining McKinsey, the consulting firm that I was with for a number of years. And I spent about 3 months just kind of writing about that experience, character sketches, memories that I had of Damascus, of Syrians, of other CIA officers. And I think really just kind of processing some of what I lived through and seen through writing. I put it aside when I joined McKinsey because I don't know how many of you are aware of what management consulting is, but you end up working about 75 hours a week, and it's pretty hard to write a novel when you're doing that. And so I kind of put the manuscript aside and came back to it about 5 years later for a number of reasons, was able to take some time to actually write. And I think having that space in between the first go at writing and then coming back to it, I was able to look at the manuscript again, and I kind of realized it's like what I'd worked on before was like really bad from a commercial writing standpoint. No one would have wanted to buy it or probably read it. But I still wanted to write, and I really loved the process of just writing. And so I sat down and started to get a little bit more structured about it and thought, how do I put something together that I would want on my nightstand and that someone else would actually want to read? I think having the space between my time working on Syria and my time at the agency, and that was also helpful. I had a little bit more maybe objectivity about it, and I thought, okay, I really want to do 2 things with this other than just kind of have people enjoy the story and the characters and drive through the narrative. But there were 2 themes I wanted to bring out in the book. One of them was I wanted to get the CIA right insofar as I could. And obviously it's a novel, right? So I do take there are breaches of tradecraft in there that I've added to make things more dramatic. But I wanted to get the agency right. You sort of show up at the CIA, and after about 2 days, you realize that everything you see in the movies and other books is completely wrong. It's wonderful, and it can be wildly entertaining, but by the second page of most spy thrillers, the protagonists in real life would have been arrested for some kind of gross malfeasance or doing something illegal on American soil. And I thought when I looked at the real business of intelligence work, particularly that of a case officer, there's a ton of human drama and intrigue, and not to mention just the tradecraft, and particularly some of the rituals around surveillance detection that I included in the book. I think all that stuff is really dramatic and interesting, and it's not explored in a lot of spy fiction, and I wanted to bring that to life. I also wanted to do a bit with the CIA, like a Michael Connelly might do with a police procedural or courtroom drama, where you're bringing some of the bureaucracy and the procedure and the policy to life, even the stuff that's kind of not glamorous, but that allows the reader to get drawn into this world because it's sort of based on, the authentic organization of the CIA and how it runs itself. So I wanted to get the CIA right. I also wanted to get Syria right. I think a lot of spy fiction, not to necessarily knock it, but it's pretty one-sided. There's sort of good and evil, and there's a superhero protagonist, and the bad guys are sort of diabolical, Russians or Iranians or something like that. And I was not particularly interested in writing that kind of book. I wanted the real Syria to come through. So I've got 3 or 4 characters in the book who are Syrian, and their point of view drives the story forward, and have agency in the book. And I think the conflict in Syria is so complicated, and there's so many different perspectives on it, that I wanted to show those perspectives and bring that to life. And I wanted to bring, I think, also to do something with the war and the people in the book that sort of express it, that draws some kind of tension between moral clarity, right? So there's good guys and there's bad guys in the story for sure, but there's also a lot of moral ambiguity in the book. Bad guys do good things, good guys do bad things, and I thought, to me, that just felt more like the human experience that I knew and the Syria that I saw during the war. So I wanted to get those kind of 2 big things right. So I sat down to write the thing. It was really fun. It was also really painful to finally get the thing out there. But I'm really happy with the way it turned out, and I hope that as folks open the book, that not only will they be sort of drawn into just a narrative that's fun to read and turn the pages, which ultimately is what I'm going for, but that as you go through it, you kind of get to know the real CIA a little bit better, and you get to know what Syria was like and what it felt like, to be in the early years of that war. So really excited to be in conversation with you about the book today.
Thanks. Thanks also for braving I-35 this morning.
Yes, someone had to do it. It was dangerous.
We really appreciate it. And if I didn't say it in the top, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
I read it quickly. As soon as it was published, and I enjoyed it. I recommended it, and to lots of folks in different venues. So I think it's just a really good thing. So you covered the first time. I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you found your way into intelligence, the CIA. You answered that. Sounds like intelligence found you.
Yeah.
To a certain extent, but the specialization is of interest. I mean, this is a school of public policy, so we've got a number of folks in our student cohort that are exploring jobs in Washington through federal agencies, intelligence, analytic work. And so this is all of interest to all of us. Now, was that your idea to become a Middle East analyst, or were you just a talented undergraduate that they identified, brought you in, and then somebody assigned you to the team and you were a Middle East analyst?
Yeah. So I'll answer this truthfully, and I don't know if it's a good answer or a bad answer, but I was very young, right? And I had studied abroad, and I had traveled a lot, mostly in Europe. I spoke French. And because NISA came to recruit, I was going to be in NISA. So I literally got a call from one of the recruiters 2 months or something before I showed up. And they said, you're going to work on Syria. And someone gave some kind of reason around Syria having been part of the French mandate. Although no Syrians really, it wasn't no one speaking French in Syria, from Lebanon. But that was it. And so I was in the funnel as a Syria analyst.
Off you go. So for the uninitiated, NISA is Near East South Asia, one of the analytic offices at CIA. But don't spend a lot of time memorizing that since they've changed all the names.
Yeah.
It's now part of the Middle East Mission Center. So that's great. Now, you've spoken, I've heard a few of your other talks in preparing for this, and you've spoken in very flattering terms about how challenging, interesting, and what the daily excitement you had being a CIA analyst. Nonetheless, you left after 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, that's true.
And I'm a little curious, what were some of the factors that led you to believe that this wasn't a career for you at CIA? Didn't you like to do something else?
Yeah. Well, so I think I had gotten to a point where I was sort of, and maybe this wasn't really true, but it felt true at the time, that I was worried that if I stayed, that I would just be there forever, and that would be my career. And I was enjoying the work, but I sort of made the half joke about what, Wendy's, like literally the private sector experience I had up to that point in my life was as a cashier at Wendy's and installing sprinkler systems. And so I was in my early 30s, and I was thinking, like, I don't know how businesses work. I don't know how they make decisions, and it felt to me like I wanted, and I thought at the time I might leave for a few years and then come back to something that would be more related to national security or intel or something like that. But I was excited to kind of get out and explore a little bit, and I felt like I wanted that learning experience. We also, my wife and I, kind of wanted to get out of DC for a while, and and coming down to Dallas for a couple of years to take a consulting job that allowed me to get inside a whole bunch of companies and learn how they work was really appealing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was thinking as you were describing that, maybe in your application, you referred to that as putting out fires, the irrigation system. So obviously, anybody who's read the book knows you're extremely well informed and on the situation in Syria and Middle East more generally. You have views, including on policies that the U.S. government might have adopted, implemented over the time. Yet we know that runs counter to the core ethos of being an intelligence analyst, which is just the facts, objectivity, neutrality, no policy, preference. Do you have any difficulty, since you have these strong views and you're well-informed views, you know what you're talking about, writing intelligence on a regular basis that was straight down the middle, free of any personal bias or any preference that you might have had when you went home and actually thought about the problem?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it is certainly true that every analyst is going to they have policy views on. I mean, you can't look at these countries for 12 hours a day and think, like, I just don't care what we do, So every analyst there is going to have a perspective about what Washington, what the president should be doing about this or that situation. So I think it's certainly, as you know, like, foolish to pretend otherwise. And so I certainly did have those views as a Syria analyst, many of which we'll probably talk about here in a few minutes. But I honestly don't think it was hard to separate the work of writing things that were not value laden, were not sort of judgmental or emotional, but just relayed what's going on, why is it happening, what does it mean for the U.S. I think one of the first things that they sort of feed into you as a new analyst is this job is about telling the truth to whoever is reading this stuff, and it's about being objective and fact-based. And I think that the analytic cadre then and now takes a tremendous amount of pride in that as part of their craft. And instances of even the allegation of writing something that's politicized or something is taken very seriously at low levels of the organization. It matters a lot to us, and so I think it was actually not hard to separate what I was writing from my sort of personal beliefs about what should happen, because it was almost like two different ways. I knew that what I thought would be wise to do, or that President Obama or whatever should have done, had no bearing at all on the kind of objective analysis that I had to write to inform that policy.
And in that sense, it's a bit of a credit to the training.
I think so.
And
Yeah.
the culture. And
Yeah.
as our friend John Brennan describes it, the ethos of the business.
Yeah.
You didn't come with that. You acquired that. That
Yes.
was delivered.
Oh, for sure. And I think a lot of the newer analysts sometimes, even before because there can be a period of you show up and it might be 4, 5, 6 months before you can get into what was then called CAP, career analyst program.
At the Sherman Kent School.
Right, exactly. And I think sometimes the analysts who show up and maybe have 2 or 3 weeks on the job and are starting to write something or helping someone write something, you kind of get a little, they haven't gone through that training yet, and you think about the job a little bit differently, and it has to be educated out of them.
On a similar topic, writing, we spend a lot of time here in graduate policy school, working with our students, helping them improve their writing. So this is writing for policy, intelligence writing, and I'm personally a big fan of the director of analysis at CIA, and they're very disciplined, objective writing style, very crisp, very concise, and we try to convey that to our students. You obviously have a great skill and great talent for writing. So my question for you was it easy, or was it a daily frustration to try to write in DA style?
Yeah.
We assess that, we judge that with confidence at this level, that level, or the other level. Or was it a constant struggle for you to suppress what's obviously a natural talent for you, creative and expressive writing?
Yeah. I think it actually was a little bit of a challenge for me. Like, I remember sometimes my bosses would trot out what was then called the DI style guide, you know, when pieces were being edited, and I'd be like, oh God, the style guide again. Like, I just didn't like it, to be honest with you. And it was kind of hard to get that beaten into me. I did try to sneak some creative flourishes into the pieces occasionally.
They'll eventually trade that out of you.
They will eventually trade that out of you. I do think that I was successful in getting the word Hobbesian nightmare into a PDB at some point early in the series. I don't know if the 9 layers of review sort of collectively blacked out and let that through, but it did make it.
You missed that on senior.
Yeah, exactly.
That's terrific. You mentioned a little bit earlier, now turning to the story a bit more directly. You mentioned earlier, some of the characters, Sam Joseph, our case officer, protagonist, and Miriam Haddad, his agent, and a colorful cast of other characters that I just enjoyed getting to know and hearing about, and watching them perform under stress. Where did these come from? Are these real people? Are these composites of people, or is this out of whole cloth? Because these are some pretty colorful and interesting characters.
Yeah.
Several of whom I think I recognize.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I have to be careful. I'm going to say it's a highly classified state secret who these characters are based off of. The answer is that most of them are composites of people I knew at the agency, so maybe you do recognize some of them. So like Sam, for example, is like, I get the question a lot, is like, is Sam me? And he's obviously not in any way. I took 3 case officers with whom I had worked pretty closely and started to write down stories that I'd heard them tell, or things I knew about them, or just the mannerisms. And over time in the writing process, he kind of became his own character and had his own energy and drive, but started as this kind of composite. It was the same for the very colorful station chief, Artemis Proctor, who
Handy with the shotgun.
Extremely foul-mouthed and is very. I think she's a wonderful character, but it kind of started as a composite of a few female case officers that I knew and went from there. The analysts actually. This is what I probably do need more careful with, because the 2 analysts that are in the book are actually, I've obviously changed the names, but they're basically real people.
Are they still on your team?
Well, I actually got a note from somebody who'd been on my team who was like, you need to cover up the fact that this person is actually this person better, because it's so obvious who they are. But most of the characters, and the same with the Syrians actually, I sort of, Assad actually is in the book himself, but a lot of the senior Syrian officials are based off of real senior Syrian officials that I had studied when I was at the agency.
Thanks for that. So loyalty and betrayal.
Yeah.
On the book jacket, that's sort of at the heart of this. And you already described the relationship between the case officer and his source, Miriam, a Syrian. you did find one of the central tenets of American human doctrine, and that is that there can be no emotional or close and continuing physical relationship with sources for obvious reasons, because of the conflict of interest that creates in the handling officer. Why did you seize on that? And what do you find that useful for? Because for an operations officer, you know, every hackle on your neck stands straight up. We've seen it happen. It never ends well. It's vigorously investigated and punished, as you reflect in the book.
Yeah.
What drew you to that particular red line?
Yeah. Well, I was really my favorite spy novel, or probably my favorite novel, is John le Carré's Little Drummer Girl, which explores some similar dynamics in the relationship between the Israeli handling officer and his English agent. And I remember reading that as, I think I read it as a teenager, you know, probably 15 or 16, and I thought that the depths of sort of emotion that you can get to and the energy that you can get to in that relationship was really quite interesting and powerful. And I think as I started writing this book, I was struck at, you know, I'd read Little Drummer Girl before I ever joined the agency or thought about it, but then sort of watching some of these case officer agent relationships at the agency, talking with case officers about it, you realize that even if you put aside the romantic attraction or anything, I mean, it's a very intimate relationship. I mean, you're sort of, they're exposing themselves to you, the case officer, if they're handling it well, is also, you know, reciprocating some of that to build trust in the relationship. There's some undercurrents of manipulation in there too. Obviously, the stakes are incredibly high. And then I felt like if you layer on top of that romantic attraction, the fact that, you know, then the case officer is breaking rules, obviously the agent is spying for a foreign power, you're dealing with a tremendous amount of potential energy that, you know, makes it a lot easier to not only just drive the narrative forward in a novel, but to, you know, really kind of create a lot of tension and intrigue in the inner lives of the characters that you as the reader hopefully want to see worked out through the book. So it just felt like it was this great mix of all this stuff that made it really explosive. And I knew that I wanted there to be, even if it was sort of illicit in some senses, there to be kind of love at the center of the book, because I wasn't really particularly interested in writing. I mean, the book is dealing with some pretty grim stuff, but I wasn't interested in writing a book that ultimately took a pretty dour perspective on the potential inside human relationships.
You succeeded. It
Thank you.
adds a tremendous amount of complexity to the story. Speaking of complex characters, I'm now thinking of Miriam a bit. And correct me if I'm wrong, but as I read this, I sensed that the narrator, that you in this case, had some sort of appreciation, some kind of empathy, or at least understanding for some of the people on the regime side.
Yeah.
And the dilemma they found themselves in. It seems as though some of the characters, even though they're part of the ruling clique of Bashar Assad, were nonetheless trapped, unable to escape, part of a corrupt system they created, but were now unable to get out of. Where's that from? That kind of empathy for the evil side, the people who brought this all on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so you use the word trapped, and I think that's a good one. I remember listening to and watching and sort of hearing testimony from some of these security guys on the Syrian side in the early months really of conflict. And, you know, many of them came from very sort of humble or even, you know, less than advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. They hadn't really profited much from the regime. They were doing work that in our context you might see as something akin to like police work, right, at the time, and certainly before the crisis. And you know, they were kind of lower class, largely Alawite guys who come from the coast, and they were not advantaged people. And the overwhelming sense you got from hearing the stories and listening to them was that they also felt trapped in the system completely, like they were just stuck. And I think that dynamic was interesting to me because there's definitely a tendency, and look, I mean, I'm not, I think the book hopefully makes it clear that I view the Assad regime as a horrendous force, and it's done despicable things to its people, but there are individuals in that system who are deeply ambivalent about it and who felt like they had no alternatives, you know. And whether or not that's true, it's a slightly different thing, but that's how they felt, and that's how they communicated and thought about it in those early months and years of the war. And so I was interested in bringing some of those characters to life, because I don't think that story is frequently told or really maybe even allowed to be told in a lot of the Western coverage of the war, which has tended to it's either sort of black and white, you know, there's good guys and bad guys, or it's just everything's so complicated and that place is so messed up, we just want to keep it at arm's length. And I think that the dynamic, especially of being in a system or a structure, whether it's a political system or a family, that cuts off a lot of your choice and a lot of your agency, is not something, at least me, but maybe a lot of Americans don't really experience that, like someone in Syria would. And I thought that dynamic to me was similar to adding love into the case officer agent relationship, was one that gives you a lot of ways to deal with the character and what they want, and builds tension over the course of the book.
It is interesting, succeeds at that, and there are historic analogies, of course. Even regimes, people with varying gradations of culpability.
Yeah,
For
sure.
what the regime's responsible for. Many of them just being dragged along.
Yeah.
Unable to escape, as we said. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but you mentioned John le Carré. I'll ask you, there are a lot of fans of spy fiction in here, a lot of avid readers. Who's your favorite? What'd you try to learn from them? You mentioned John le Carré.
Yeah.
So we'll grant that. I think he's the master. What did you try to learn from him? And who else is out there that really inspires you, is worth reading?
Yeah. Well, part of the reason I love le Carré is because I think he's not even really a spy novelist. He's just a wonderful novelist and storyteller. And so, you know, who just happens to write about espionage. And who doesn't really have any care, at least in later books, for the trade craft or anything like that. And he's driving stories forward with the characters and his storytelling, which I love. I love Charles McCary. I think he made some comment at one point around how he wished that he'd never gotten stuck writing spy fiction, because he just wanted to write stories that are, again, character driven and look at love and, you know, families and this kind of thing. So he really works that into his books, and I really appreciate that. I love the late Jason Matthews. His Red Sparrow trilogy, I think, is wonderful, and I found it. I had never heard of it. I discovered it when I was like almost through the first draft of my book, and I was like, "Damn it, Jason! Like, this is exactly what I want to be doing." I think it's just wonderful, and I really like all of David Ignatius's stuff. I think he does a great job of bringing kind of the real CIA and some of the procedural aspects that I was talking about to life. I read a lot of other stuff that's probably much less connected to reality. So, like, you know, I'll read all the Silva books, and I enjoy those kind of beach reads. But for the stuff that I think is really dealing with the actual business of it, it's probably McCary and le Carré and Matthews and Ignatius. Those are the big ones.
Thanks. I appreciate you recognizing our former colleague, Jason Matthews. And I was immediately reminded in your surveillance scenes, these extended surveillance detection routes in advance of operational activity. The opening of Red Sparrow is Moscow rules, trade craft. And you and he both do a great job of capturing. SDRs are thrilling and fun, but tremendous opportunity to fail and betray your agent. So good, thanks for that. And let's turn to the region and the Civil War itself. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the wind up. We want to get into some of the details, but could you just sort of map out the arc in Syria from sort of 2010, early 2011, as the Arab Spring arrives, people are in the streets, there's optimism, there's hope, there's been change. In Egypt, and then it's fair to say 11 years later, we're in essentially a frozen conflict involving regional powers, a proxy war underway, so much capital destruction in the country. Now, partway through there, you left, but I know you continued to follow the topic you couldn't otherwise. What are the key points for people to understand how this turned from hope to despair and pessimism?
Yeah. Gosh, I mean, it's been, there's so much to cover there. I think, when we started to get the protests in Tunisia and then Egypt, Syria was at the time, it kind of, maybe even backing up a little bit from that, when we were writing about it in the DI, I mean, we were almost entirely focused on foreign policy topics, to be blunt. It was how does Syria connect to the Arab-Israeli peace process? How does it connect to Lebanon? How does it connect to Iraq? So it was through this lens of it sits in a very strategically important position in the region. There's not a lot of oil. There wasn't a lot of oil. They don't have a nuclear weapon. It's a small country, right? So from a geostrategic standpoint, it just was kind of this. It was like a one PDP a year kind of prior to 2011, and maybe two, but not many. And there were when protests started in Tunisia and Egypt, we kind of a lot of the same kindling was there in Syria, right? I mean, there's probably a very long laundry list I could give from the predatory security services, very narrow patronage networks, wage stagnation, droughts and economic and water mismanagement in the east and northeast of the country that had drawn all of these people into this kind of hinterlands around the major cities. Big youth bulge, just like most of the other places in the Middle East, and it was ripe for the same kind of protest. Now, the thing that made that first few months so challenging was that I think in some respects, from a forecasting standpoint, we had gotten to the limits of what you could really predict using the intelligence we have, because what we were actually in the middle of was a mass psychological shift of, 2 months ago, none of this was possible. Now it is. And, things changed inside people's heads rapidly and overnight. And so this kind of wall of fear that the Syrian security services had built up over 40 years fell down pretty quickly. And for the first, to kind of chunk the conflict up into bits, the first year or so, it was very fashionable in a lot of the press to kind of describe the Syrian regime as using very, very, very brutal methods early, and it's not exactly true. So for the first year or so, they primarily deployed their security services to try to quell the protests. That obviously didn't work because you're sort of using the tool to solve things that's actually causing the problem to begin with, and so they couldn't. And frankly, the regime had no political legitimacy, no civic institutions. The state had sort of hollowed, and it only had a repressive apparatus that was used to try to suppress this protest movement that grew from, one or two kind of small pockets in southern Syria in March of 2011 to by that summer, it was really a nationwide protest movement. And it was largely peaceful, although there were the sort of seedlings of an insurgency happening in the spring of that year too. In part driven by the fact that the regime itself was realizing that it didn't have the tools to combat a kind of a civil opposition movement, and the regime itself sought to militarize the conflict. And so they let Salafi jihadist prisoners out of Sedna prison to sort of form some of the initial armed groups that would fight the regime, which is hard for us to sort of understand, but they felt they had to do that, so they had someone to fight. The networks that I talked about that had sent people into Iraq actually turned on the Syrians, and you had this sort of battle-hardened group of Iraq jihad veterans who began to take up arms against the regime. But you had, for that first year, kind of coexisting the beginnings and growth of this armed movement and the protests. What ended up happening was that as violence, sort of ticked up, by 2012, we really had the beginnings of like a scorched earth sort of counterinsurgency campaign on the part of the Syrians, and not counterinsurgency in the way that we do it, counterinsurgency in the way that the Russians do it in Chechnya, right? So it's just destroying things. So and the Iranians and Hezbollah got involved in 2012, but really over the course of the next couple of years, the Syrian regime, I think, was beaten back to controlling maybe 20-25% of the actual country. So they were losing. In 2013, I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more. It was clear that we weren't going to get involved. The Russians got involved in 2015, and over the next 4 or 5 years, the Syrian government sort of clawed back a lot of that territory. But it's now, I think your word of it being a frozen conflict is there is still some activity around these lines of control, but there's essentially 4 kind of zones of influence in the country. You still have like sort of ISIS, underground kind of terror capacity in central Syria. And you've got 5 militaries that are actively involved in the war, and so it's a huge mess.
I want to come back and give you an opportunity to forecast, to look forward. We also want to get to our questions, but so combining our discussion of the ethos of intelligence with events on the ground, let's go back to 2013, and you as an analyst weren't allowed to have a perspective on the U.S. administration's decision not to respond militarily when the Assad regime crossed the president's red line and used chemical munitions against civilian populations. But your characters are not so constrained,
Right.
so they betray a view. Looking back on this now with some benefit of some hindsight, how do you assess that dilemma that the White House was in and the decision that was ultimately taken? Many of us, people smarter, better informed than I am, would regard that as the low point of President Obama's foreign policy record and with long-term strategic implications. What's your take on it?
Yeah. Well, I think that just to kind of back up a little bit to even the beginning of the conflict, I think to explain where that actually came from was from the very early days of the unrest, it was pretty clear to me personally, I was talking about my views, that there was a tremendous gap between our stated objectives in Syria and what we were actually willing to put, like the resources we were actually willing to commit to achieve those objectives. I think that gap was driven by an assumption that Assad's demise was inevitable, that Ben Ali had fled, Mubarak was gone, Gaddafi was gone, never mind that was the Air Force, but there was sort of a arc of history bending toward these guys being deposed, and we could kind of, although I do not think that folks in the administration would have described it this way, I think the result of it was that they had this view that we could kind of sit back, we could say things, and then he'll be gone in 6 months or 9 months or whatever, and then we'll figure it out then. Over time, as it became clear that Assad had staying power and that his foreign backers were going to very seriously support him, that gap just kind of widened. And I think by the time you got to, and we kind of started to, realize in 2012, 2013 that the Syrians weren't they were kind of testing this red line. They were poking a little bit to see what could they do and what could they get away with. And that gap kind of persisted. Well, I mean, I think my view on the red line situation, and I think I would also be speaking for a lot of the other analysts who were on my team, was that it was very hard to understand why, once we committed to that, and we could have done something, why we did not. And the debates around this, in retrospect, have kind of gotten sucked into this weird dichotomy of either any kind of intervention would have had to have hit the post to Assad, or we should have done nothing. And I think that's just not true. We could have easily responded in a punitive way to the use of sarin and other chemical weapons. We, by the way, also could have done that with respect to some of the conventional weapons that have killed far more people in the conflict, like they used barrel bombs. We could have set up some amount of strategic deterrence in those years about the kinds of violence that we, and it sounds sort of callous to say this, but the kinds of violence that we would have permitted and not permitted in their conduct of the war. I think we could have done that, and we would not have had to go all the way toward removing Assad. And my view is that we should have done more, but that it probably would have been unwise to actually try to unseat him, given the very fragmented and complicated and problematic dynamics that we saw on the ground with opposition, and that we just didn't have there was not a partner who would have been able to construct a better political entity that would have been amenable to our interests. So I think on the red line, pretty clear answer, but I always I never like when it gets sucked into these debates around, we would have had to depose off it. No, we could have punished them and sort of fulfilled our presidential word without having to go all the way.
Thanks for sharing that view. Real quickly before I let you, forecast what we could look forward to in your perspective. There was another U.S. policy in play at the time, and that was out of a classic U.S. foreign policy playbook, find some local forces, proxy forces, moderates, if we were looking for at the time, who we could train and equip and deploy so that we would have some people on the ground fighting for our interests at our nation. Some of these were open programs, some of these were less open programs, but they all seem to have failed miserably. What's your take on that? Was that did we fail to execute, find the right people, give them the right weapons, train them, and send them off on the right missions, or was the premise wrong? Was there never a moderate group of people willing to go to the Capitol and fight that we could help?
Yeah, I think so. My view on sort of our ability to engage with Syrian partners, I think it's helpful to chunk it out into the policy being Syrian politics and the conflict against Assad and the ISIS fight. Because I think when we look at the fight against the Islamic State, we have backed and built up a very credible force in northeastern Syria, the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, primarily Kurdish militia, who have been and were extremely effective in working with us in the counter-ISIS fight. But when you look at it through the lens of the potential for regime change in Damascus, my view is that there was never really a group that would have been, I suppose if we had been willing to commit a tremendous amount of national power and resources above what we did, it may have theoretically been possible, but in the scope of what we were sort of willing to do, even at the high end, I think these opposition groups, the ones that at least were not, outwardly supposed to be jihadists, never had the capacity, the training, the cohesion to really be successful. And very early in the fight, it was, like I said, all those guys with the Iraq jihad credentials and the pre-existing organizations, really familial ties, military training. They were the ones who were always going to be the most effective on the battlefield, and they were from a very early stage. So I think that was doomed to failure from the start.
Interesting. Thanks for that. Okay, last substantive question. I know Will's jotting notes on his pad, which is a warning. Now, so I heard you
got ideas for his next album.
Yeah. I heard you talk to my friend Michael Morrell a couple days ago, and he asked you to forecast. I'll ask you to do the same. I wasn't surprised that a DI analyst would have a pessimistic take on the topic. So it comes with the territory, right? We expect nothing less. But yours was particularly pessimistic on prospects for unified Syria anytime in the near future of any variety. sort of, you were comparing it, as I recall, to the Sri Lankan conflict, sort of decades-long, persistent, unresolved conflict. Is that really how you see Syria, and why? What are the main forces at play here, and how do we end up with essentially a frozen, unresolved, destroyed society?
Yeah. Well, I think we've kind of, the lens that I take on sort of where the lines are right now is that we've probably reached some of the limits of what the regime can actually retake because of what it's become in a lot of respects. I mean, it's more like it's more like a warlord kind of fiefdom or a militia than it is like thinking about it like a government is maybe not the right way to look at what Assad has.
You're referring
now.
to the central
To
government.
Assad, to the central government,
not-
yeah.
not some of the regional
Yeah. So their ability to sort of project power, potentially retake the Northwest, which is under opposition control, or the Northeast, which is under Kurdish control, or certainly the areas that Turkey occupies, is probably pretty limited. So I do kind of see it as largely frozen. And if I just look at kind of history, you think, well, okay, how do civil wars end? I mean, there's really only two off ramps. There's a political settlement, or one side wins. In the vast majority of civil wars, negotiated settlements don't work. One side wins. The vast majority of civil wars, I think we looked at this when, so we looked at this maybe, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago. So it was during 2012, 2013, something like that. Most civil wars last about 10 years, and they go a lot longer if you have multiple parties on the ground. So check in the Syrian case, and if you have multiple foreign parties that intervene, so check. So I don't think it's, and when you look at just sort of the political prospects for a resolution, like they're basically non-existent. The process ongoing in Geneva is sort of kabuki theater, right? It's just, there's nothing that's going to happen, and the military lines are pretty frozen. So, and everyone's pretty tired. Later onto that, the fact that I think everyone kind of has on the ground in Syria has a view of, I haven't won, but I also haven't lost, and I maybe can't lose, depending on how you define the objective. So I think we're in for just a lot of, it's not to say that the situation won't evolve, but I think the prospects for some kind of resolution that returns Syria to the borders it had under one governing entity anytime, in the next even 5 years is probably not realistic. But, like the Sri Lankan example is a good one, right? I mean, that civil war went on for 25 plus years, and I think it did end. It ended. And I think the Syrian one probably will too, because the government, Assad regime, views this, and they viewed this early on as a generational project to, recapture what was being lost. And I think if they win in 2035, that's a victory.
Yeah, but the burden, of course, over these decades is on the Syrian
On the actual people, right?
So last question, I read very closely at the final pages of the book, and I'll bring it to you. Sam and Miriam are still alive and servicing dead drop sites in the best denied area tradition. So does that mean there's a sequel?
So I've outlined a sequel, but I haven't started writing it. So for at least the characters that survive Damascus Station, there might be some future life in another book. But I've spent most of my time writing another book that's in kind of the same universe. So some characters overlap, but it's set in the present day. It's focused on Russia, and it's exploring the question of the next phase of the U.S.-Russia spy war, and maybe a little bit more colloquially, which I've had more fun with. What would it look like if we really tried to stick it to Putin? And so I've been having fun with that. There's also an angle of Putin's a character, kind of like Assad is, and there's an angle around thoroughbred racehorse breeding and dealing too, and commercial operations. So I'm having
I'm ready.
it's a weird stew, but it's working for me.
In a couple of years, we'll be talking about that one.
Yeah, you're wading into some pretty deep water there. It's
Yeah.
not fiction in Russia. All right, good. So I know you've been waiting, you've been patient. Thanks. We'll take a few more minutes.
Let's have some questions. Well,
All right, so this is the one I was scribbling down, but tell us a little bit more, and this may blend into the novel and your professional background, about your view of Assad. So you've never met the guy, but you've spent a good part of your professional life studying him, thinking about him, looking at the effects of his actions, things like that. I have a vivid memory in early 2010, so about a year and a half before all this breaks out. I was running a think tank in London, and one of my colleagues there was active with some of the Syrian diaspora resistance, including one of his cousins. I'm forgetting his first name, but another Assad. And
It's a lot of cousins running around.
yeah, there are a lot of Assad cousins running around. But we bring this guy in, and at the time, you know, I was relatively uninformed. I had a view of Assad as kind of, I know he was the son of a brutal despot, but he's kind of this filthy ophthalmologist. He's got this glamorous wife that Vanity Fair is profiling. And then, but this cousin comes in and says, no, he's awful, he's really nasty, he's a dictator. And oh, okay, it sounds like you guys, you know, had some bad, you know, whatever their equivalent of Thanksgiving family dinners were.
Yeah.
But anyway, but then, you know, a couple of years later, we start to see that this guy is really brutal and, you know, fairly evil. So tell us a little bit more about, was he always that? Did something switch? Like, where and how did he become who he is today?
Yeah. I did have some fun with him in the book, and he deserves it. So I think, you know, there's a narrative around him that I think was fed in part by the fact that, and he did his residency in London, but it was like 2 years, right? And he was in a very sort of tight-knit community while he was there. So like sort of positioning him as a Westerner was always kind of insane, right? But that was the case early in his presidency that he was talked about in that way. He was recalled to Damascus in 94 after his brother died in a car accident. And he spent 6 years with the old man, with his dad, like learning how the whole system worked and building up alliances inside the regime with a lot of these old guard guys that would allow him to consolidate power. And he learned how it worked. And over time, when you look at the different portfolios that he was sort of given, they were increasing in importance and relevance as he was trained up. So he is a very he's not an emotional guy at all. He is ice cold. I think because of, just to share an interesting anecdote, which is out there in Sam Dogger's book about Syria called Assad, A Rebirth in the Country, which is not well known, but Sam documents it well. Assad was sort of also, he's got a very thin skin, and he was, you know, not the oldest. He wasn't supposed to be this guy in charge. To your point, he looks, and not to be uncharitable to him, but he kind of looks a little bit weird. My understanding is he speaks Arabic with like a lisp. You know, he's got big ear. He just kind of looks like he's a kind of a punk. Like, people look at him and they're like, I don't really respect you physically. He sleeps around inside the Syrian elite and kind of uses that position to sort of exert power over others. You know, he's a pretty ruthless, kind of calculating, cold guy, and always was. But it was sort of clothed in this trapping of, yeah, he's got Ozma, who's this, you know, very well-spoken, you know, attractive wife who's on the cover of Vogue 2 weeks before the protests started, which is bad timing. And he, you know, but he was very calculated in those early years. I mean, he spent the first 5 or 6 years of his presidency or reign, or whatever you want to call it, you know, defeating challenges to his authority inside the government. I mean, I think, you know, I talk about how we looked at Syria through this lens of foreign policy and crises in Lebanon after the Hariri assassination. I mean, I think it's a very good case to be made that a lot of the Hariri assassination, a lot of these kind of internal killings that happened in the regime in the early years are much more like sort of the tail end of The Godfather, where they were killing people who were plotting against him. And so they built this, you know, they built this thing up. And by the time the crisis started, you know, they had done some things to get this regime in place and to get it consolidated. And they were not willing to let it go. And frankly, they lived in sort of a political system where, you know, compromise wasn't it was not advisable for your health. You know, I think they all saw it as sort of, if we don't do this, we're all going to be killed. And I think he understood and had been raised up in a system where he's like, I know what I have to do to protect what my family built.
There are no retired presidents.
Yeah.
And I also remember at that time, we talked about the timing of the magazine covered. There were many people in the American administration who wanted to go to Damascus and make peace. With the Israelis against their own interests or otherwise. And so we probably colossally misjudged him.
Yeah.
Early on.
I think so.
Others, who we have? Back in the corner.
Hi, my name is Christopher Shafiq. I'm a first year MGBS student here. And I'm kind of going off that question I'm going to ask. How did Assad just manage to hold on to power when all the others fell before it? And within that, why did the security forces turn against him? Especially if they're not the ones benefiting from the regime. You're just talking about the average guys.
Yeah. Well, so I think there's a lot of different answers to that, but I think the simple one is that they had built Syria's ethnic and religious composition is similar in some ways to Iraq or Lebanon and very dissimilar from Egypt and Tunisia, right? It's 10% or so Alawite, 10% Christian of various sects, 5% or so Druze, it's about 65% Sunni Arab, the remainder are Kurds. And so it's in a modern Middle East where those identities, for a whole host of reasons, are sort of like fault lines and became much more aggravated in the wake of the Lebanese Civil War and in the wake of Iraq and really in the wake of like 1979 and all that happened in the region since. They built Assad family built a government, and in particular a repressive apparatus, their security forces, that are overwhelmingly Alawite. And they, when those guys who were like the low-level, mid-level guys were looking at this thing early on, there was no sort of other side to go to. There was no bridge because they looked at the dynamics too and thought, if we do this, we're gonna get killed. And they were in this really uncomfortable situation where that sectarian identification is like uncrossable. You can't, if you have a security service that's 80-90% Alawite, how is it going to partner with a largely Sunni Arab dominated opposition movement, even if they're peaceful, right? They're fragmented and all that. So that sectarian angle to it was one of the major differences with a place like Egypt or Tunisia, where you could kind of have institutions that said, we're just going to sit on the sidelines, or we're actually going to back the opposition. There was no way to do that in the Syrian context. They've been very smart about building a regime that if you started to break it, it would have to actually break the state. So everything would have to fall apart. It wasn't, these pieces weren't built so that you could just sort of peel them away from the family.
Hello, my name is Mccluskey. I'm a graduate student here at the College of Education. But if you had to sum up to like a form or to a policymaker, what's the so what in the situation in Syria moving forward? Why does it matter to foreign policy decision makers, etc.?
Yeah, from an American standpoint.
Yes.
Well, I mean, if you just look at where we are today, we've got almost 1,000 troops in northeastern Syria, and we have a partnership with those Kurdish militias and the Syrian Democratic Forces that has been used to beat back the caliphate, right? The Islamic State's caliphate over the past 5 years. So we have a tremendous amount of our own credibility, and frankly, we have these partnerships to thank for taking ISIS and bringing it to basically an underground terrorist movement as opposed to something that's the size of Jordan. So that's one big so what that I think we for moral and strategic reasons we should care deeply about those forces and what happens in northeastern Syria. I think from a moral standpoint, we have an obligation as a very powerful country to continue to help facilitate humanitarian access in Syria. The Russians have been trying to close border crossings that are not in the regime's control over the past couple of years, and I think that we have continued interest in making sure that the UN can send material into opposition-controlled areas. I do think, though, that we have, generally speaking, as I talk about the gap between sort of where we'll commit power and what our stated objectives are, I do think that successive administrations have gotten way over their skis in identifying what our real core strategic concerns are in Syria. So, it's obviously no longer part of our strategic calculus that Assad must go. And I think that we should probably be a little bit more honest about that. There continues to be a strain in US policymaking around trying to sort of counter Iranian influence inside Syria that I also think is, while we might prefer that, is sort of just completely out to lunch in terms of what's actually going to happen. And we should be probably more specific about, may not help to be more specific about that, but we should at least be, we should probably stop talking about that as a big strategic objective in Syria, because it's kind of the same. So if I were to sort of boil it down, I'd be like, it's humanitarian access, it's doing right by our partners in northeastern Syria, and it's continuing to have that capacity to prevent, a resurgent ISIS.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
It's a topic for another day's discussion, maybe lunch next, but how this would all be different if the Al-Kibar reactor had been completed in Syria, where an undeclared nuclear state, when this disintegration process starts. It's almost impossible to imagine the consequences.
I agree with that.
Okay, last one or two quick ones. Ruby, sorry.
Yeah, thank you for being here with us
Yeah.
today. My host mother in Jordan is actually Alawite, and I saw her transition from being very supportive of the regime to actually questioning what was happening. And the last time I checked in with her, she used the Arabic word, same Arabic word, ihtilal, like the occupation of Latakia from the Russian forces. What do you see, what do you think the role of Russia will be in Syria, and will they leave, that they have their naval bases now? What's the future of that relationship?
Well, I mean, you do hit on that sort of tension or fault line in the Alawite community where what people are willing to sort of express privately about, their beliefs about the government or about Russia or about the Iranians. And there was always a strain even prior to the war of these guys complaining about these foreign partners. But at the end of the day, there's such a strategic rationale for these relationships that everyone sort of gets over it. I mean, I think that I can't fathom why Vladimir Putin would give up his foothold in Syria. There's no reason for him to do that. It allows them to, have the facilities there, the basic port. It gives them sort of credibility and influence in an important foreign policy arena. And I think that, it's sort of unfortunate to think about, but I think if we had behaved a little bit differently in the conflict, this probably wouldn't have happened with respect to Russia's sort of, foothold in Syria. But I think it's here to stay, and I don't see why they would give it up anytime soon.
Time for one more student question. So,
Yeah, hi. So I was curious what you saw as the value and the benefit of you as an analyst actually being in Syria when you were covering the topic, and what kind of freedom of movement did you have when you were there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it, on a very obvious level, I mean, being in the country that you're studying and trying to tell people about makes a ton of sense, right? So there's just the ability to, I think it gives you insight into cultural aspects, societal dynamics, things like that can be hard if you're not spending significant time there, right? So I think that having analysts spend more time overseas is probably a good thing, definitely a good thing. And I'm glad that the agency has made its tilts over the past, 10 or 15 years to having much more sort of permanent analytic capacity overseas and rotating people in and out. When I was in Syria, I actually had, it was before the conflict. I had a lot of freedom of movement, so I went all over the place, all over the country, all over Damascus. Sometimes someone would follow me in a, sort of black car, and I always actually kind of liked it. It made me feel safer because I was, just, if I was doing tourist stuff and there's some guy wandering around, in a ill-fitting black suit and white gym socks, and he's kind of tracking me and watching and smoking, I was like, well, if someone actually is trying to hurt me, you might have to do something to stop that. That always made me feel a little bit better. But I think it's invaluable to have those experiences with the analysts, and I'm really happy that I was able to do that.
I was cross-examining David upstairs, trying to figure out how he got this intimate knowledge of the embassy and the vending machines and the streets and the souk, and asking him the same question you did about whether he was allowed to spend a lot of time out in Damascus. Clearly it worked, clearly it helped. Generated a terrific book.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
No, thank you.
I'm gonna get in line and get mine signed.
Yeah, no, please. I'd love to. Oh, hey,